Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in to Entelocius. My name is Paul. The social group is our paroxysm in the mirror. Its undertow the action with wind beneath its wings, yet it is surprising how well we collect ourselves. Group egos are peculiar assimilations in that they do not respond to their organic place. Groups are alien. Without them, Durkheimian anomie is cleanly mitigated, and the many reasons for putting anomie on a leash leave me to wonder about addictions to group junk. And in reality, I think we are not authentically desirous of our groups. They produce steady-state disruption of copulate stabilizations. They deprecate purpose. They instigate self-denial. And from the parasitic adherence, groups become eternally spurned like Promethean pinballs. This is akin to an additional double vision effect or like protraction of latent onset of Sartrean nausea. Rather, through groups we are tautologically looking into ourselves, and ironically the rhizomorph is the very last place to make this discovery. Self-interest should be redundantly internalized. To begin with, the very first group in the world is our own, but that is to say, the abundant stasis of personal refraction, where self-rudiment is firstly and lastly contained to defecatory motilities and the regeneration of local imprecation, the elastic exercise. Eventually, the whirl of desire intersperses resentment, which invades but affirms the self that is peremptorily excused, or, better for ignorant adaptation, confused for fair. Subsequent to this first group, rhizomatic discovery follows a lengthy string in which knots of identification guide virtues of self-identity into, to use Goffman's words, the amoral arts of shamelessness. The purpose of the group is instruction in this sort of edification, and we concede to the group to finally stop at some plausible, as opposed to riddled, self-identification. Most closely to our interactions, we fulfill roles, and the role of the role is like an orbital socket within which competing muscle contractions steer vision. The first place of the Uber role is the zone of virtual quintessential taboo, from which we emerge shortly after negative fulfillment. Then, speaking within arm's reach, we are disposed to group together our nearest devices of withdrawal, as if to suggest we comprise and expend mortification of the virtual ego easily from primitive natures, from a latent faculty which is not necessarily concerned with grouping for the sake of socialization, but instead for the sake of transducing an invigilating effect. With Netflix, people crash and refurbish the group. To use a sociological term, they imprint themselves endlessly, just like waves onto a coast. Generally, what we do when people are not looking becomes as contributory to group statuses as group vision, where the former is internal and anatomical and the latter is external. In the sense of group imprint, since whereas groups themselves are excessive and redundant in their guises, mobile workers are an unusually prime example. Wherever they come and go, they leave lasting impressions of their desires. Fundamentally, they paint. The old towns of Alberta are not firstly, shadow funnels for cocaine, prostitution, and transliteral containment, that is, redundant tapestries. The domestic vicissitudes of migrant workers in Leamington, Ontario, the tomato capital of Canada, spell multilateral restrictions at the exercise of supernumerary dormitory standards inwards. Filipino caretakers carouse endlessly wherever they are hosted, for they physically cannot expand their home remotely, and so forth. The group is no longer suggestive, but it is no longer important either. The value of Putnam's conceptualization of loner America is not so much its emotional appeal, at least at a level of rhizomatic tact, but its proof that community, no less the epitome of sacred industrial community, has leveled off completely, which is to say it has virtually completed itself. It is no small wonder we now ride pony the carnivalesque DMZ between disaster and government, that for indulging safer disasters we court literal carnivals, which are apolitical and, upon arrival, immediately disastrous to desire, and that from the other side are lamentable proxies, patres ignotum, whom we spend breakfasts learning to rebuke from sheer factical air. The superordinate crush with government, its treacle our banter, is a surprisingly short visit from our deception, or double vision, concerning authority, where especially the police, from whom we expect application of universal impulse, instead violate, namely racial accordance with, at least to pragmatic and empirical accounts, utter indifference except towards their own resultant adjustment, like they are fidgeting in place, On the other hand, the crush with government is exacerbated from stick-and-poke repetitions of these relentless false appropriations, which is why it so easily dissipates. That is, why it is idealized or devalued at a dropped or daily hat. The connection to its substrate is fickle, phantasmal, merely local. Motor cognition and the group are dizygotic, for the group is an involuntary action like a representation is action made involuntary. And actions have themselves in common, but almost never the representations. It is no secret motor cognition is given birth to, built, and adapted through perceptions derived from our interpretations of other individuals. And, as a result, we can expect groups to abate somatic peril at the expense of heightened somatic trifles. The group is proved infinitely redundant, even if, particularly if, it does not sacrifice somatic integrity. And for this reason we can prove value as spoiled and diminished as it would have been otherwise. When it is not redundant, during either temporal periods or vacuous extemporalizations, the primordial group, meaning the group irrespective of differentiation, experiences witch hunts, variously defined call-out cultures, and the targeted designation of persona non grata. Witch hunts are much more than enduring motifs. They are evolutionary adaptations of motor consciousness, which occur for better or worse. Tractation can sublimate and violate any number of group imperatives or virtues, for paths are unicellular and uninformed. They simply cannot obtain reference. However, when they occur to prominence within short-sighted or fragmented group spectrums, it is a suggestion of terminal group pathology. Secondly, call-out culture proposes the consequent on account of its aversion to desire, its preference to seethe the vital locus rather than propulse itself emotionally. It is like we want to be monkeys who press buttons or flip switches specifically, direly, at pains of death, for impactful attributions, provided these are surrogate potentials, and as a result we confront litanies of cost everywhere but to our essentialized body, our corpus. The group retains composure if only it will shrink. Finally, the designation of persona non grata requires transcendent scrutiny, neither twice nor doubled, but syncretic. And for this reason, apart from perceived sequestration and restriction and the obvious motor implication, it is one of the most notable, albeit unconventional contributions to rhizomatic industry and proliferation. The stranger is nominally forbidden, treife, but whether his person is specified for dejection, his soma is fledged, unapplied, and twice successful at least for his lasting plaster cultural cast. And for every attribution of ejection in which regulation performs mitotic splitting between aggrandized domesticity and the persona, a new home is marginally conceived. This revitalization occurs repeatedly as inclinations acquire new definitions. The group simply lacks finish, and this ultimately is its highest contribution. Once it has been exceeded, our furthest vision addresses group seeking where so-called failures at right living go without saying, and further are without contretemps or contre-coup. These include disproportionately where rights are spurned, abandoned, or alienated. Yet with transcendence, this can be anywhere, just like the rhizome can become anything. I leave you with a few questions to mull. First, it is interesting to wonder what exactly transpires, functionally, to permit acceptance between participation or belonging and self-realization within group parameters. What I mean to ask is, how does this settle? Where does group motor coordination learn to make peace with you? And second, drawing from Goffman, what is the purported adequacy of the equipment used to convey our acceptance of groups if, in order to yearn suggestion, we must first get over ourselves? That brings me to the end of episode 4. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please click like and subscribe. I encourage opinions, discussion, and suggestions in the comments below, particularly if you know any rhizomatic scholars or theories deserving of attention or integration. Episode 5 is about invocations and dependencies. So, mind your path, raise your vision, reach your arms, and steal your sight. Rhizomatic transcendence is around the corner. See you again.